Hey, in this lecture you will learn about loops, and loops are very important. They are one of the fundamental building blocks of the Python programming language and of every other programming language as well, because loops are crucial. So what are loops? Well, loops are basically a way that allow you to execute a statement multiple times. So what does that mean? Let's say you have a bunch of files, text files, and you want to insert a certain string inside each of these text files. So you'd have to open those text files in Python by writing the Python code that corresponds to opening a file, and then you'd insert that string inside the file and close the file and save it. So there is some code that does this opening and inserting the text and closing the file. And if you had 100 files, you'd have to execute that code 100 times, so you'd come up with, let's say, 100 lines of code, but that doesn't sound very efficient. So that's what loops are for. So a productive way to solve the problem that I just mentioned would be to create a list of these files, so a Python list of the file names, and then you would use a loop to iterate through this list of file names. And a loop would do all that in just a few lines of code. And there are two kinds of loops in Python. There is the for loop, and the example that I just mentioned would be solved using a for loop. And we also have the while loop. A while loop does also repeatedly execute a statement that you write, and it executes it as long as a given condition is true. So let's say you have a user that is trying to log in your web app, and while he keeps entering the wrong password, you'd continue executing a statement that would reject his login into your system. So while the password is wrong, reject the user, something like that. So that's about the definition of the for loop and the while loop. In the next lecture I'll show you the syntax of the for loop, and by also looking at an example. So see you in the next lecture. Good. Now you know the definition of a loop, and you know that we have for loops and while loops in Python. And in this lecture you will learn how to write for loops. Now a for loop normally iterates through a list of objects and applies some methods or some functions or some operations over each of these objects. The array that the for loop iterates through is not necessarily a list. It can be a tuple, sometimes it can be a dictionary, it can even be a string. So every object that is made of other simpler objects. So let's create a list first. Let's say emails is a list of 3 email addresses. So let's write some fake email addresses here. me@gmail.com, you@hotmail.com, and they@gmail.com. Now let's say you want to apply the print function to each item of this list. And the stupid way to do this would be to print out every item one by one. Let's say the first item, which has an index of 0, and then you do the same for emails with index of 1, and so on and so on. That's definitely not how we want to do it. So to print out these 3 items we use a for loop, and a for loop always starts with the for keyword, and then you pick a variable, let's say email. So don't confuse the email variable with the emails variable, these are totally different. And for email in emails, so here you pass a variable that holds the list you want to iterate through, and press enter, and as you see here we got the indentation. So the line that follows the first line of the loop is always indented. So that means this line here that we will write belongs to this loop. So it's part of this block. And here is where we write the action, the statement we want to execute multiple times. So we want to print the email. So that is very straightforward and very clean and very readable. And let's execute this first before I explain it to you better. Save the script first and execute. And this is script 4. So we got the 3 items printed out on the screen. And I obviously got an at wrong here, no problem. So what the code does is that you say for each item in the list emails, print out the item. And of course you can use every variable that you like if this is more readable for you. So for each item in the emails list, print out the item. Great. Let's do something more fancy here. I'll delete this line of code. And now I'd like to print out only the emails that have a Gmail address associated with them. So I don't want to print out any other item rather than the Gmail ones. So that means we want Python to make a decision. If it finds Gmail in the item, in the string, it will print it out. If it doesn't find it, will not print it out. So we want to use a conditional here, and that would be an if statement. So again, we say for each item in the list, if the string Gmail is in item, print out the item. So I'm sure this was easier than you were expecting. Let's save, Ctrl S, and execute. So we got only the Gmail accounts printed out. So again, we are saying for item in emails, and when we do this, Python grabs the first item of the list. So the first iteration is about the first item, and this item is temporarily stored in the variable item. Then while this value is stored in this variable, Python checks if the string Gmail is in that variable. So with the first item this is true, and that's why Python prints out the item. So it prints out me@gmail.com. Then it goes to the next item. If Gmail is in that item, it prints out the item. In this case, Gmail is not there, so it doesn't do anything, and it goes to the next item. So that's why we call it a loop. So the loop goes in and out until the list is exhausted. So when it goes to the third item, to the last item of the list, the loop ends and the output is generated, like here. And don't forget about indentation, so be careful and look here that we indented under the for loop, and again we indent it under the if statement, because this indentation here is part of the if block, and this one here is part of the for loop block. So very readable code, and I believe very fun to write. I'll see you in the next lecture.